With so many restrictions in place, we thought we'd do some quick-fire traveling around the country and in some cases around the world, using some of the amazing works coming up in our May auction here in Johannesburg. I'll start with this hugely important work by Henk Pierneef. It's very unusual stylistically, I think you'd agree with me. It's far more fleshy in the way it's painted, very expressionistic. This is one of the very few known studies for one of Pierneef's station panels, one of the 32 that he produced for the Johannesburg Railway between 1929 and 1932. Pierneef was commissioned by the railways to decorate the main concourse of the new station, which at the time was being positioned as the most important railway hub, not only in South Africa, but arguably on the continent. Pierneef crisscrossed the country in order to find and choose beautiful and important scenes and destinations. He painted in the Cape and in the then Transvaal predominantly. He painted the likes of Cape Town, Stellenbosch, Hermanus, and he also chose this scene, which is the farm Klipriviersberg in present-day Alberton. This was a property and a farm he knew very well. We know that he spent a lot of time with the Meyer family in the late teens and early 1920s. This was a place he obviously held close to his heart, which is potentially why he chose to return to it in order to paint one of his major panels. What are we seeing? Well, we're seeing an old Transvaal house in the center of the composition. This is a farm established by the Meyers as early as the 1840s. Pierneef always had a deep love for then Transvaal vernacular architecture as well as Cape vernacular architecture. You get a real sense of moment in a painting like this, I would argue, in that you can imagine him sitting with his canvas, with his easel, painting directly what was in front of him. He's painting quickly, he's painting with confidence, he's painting with swagger, but he's also, of course, positioning out his composition. He's putting these large trees on either side, right and left, acting almost like stage curtains being drawn apart to reveal this amazing scene in the center. He's painting the koppies up front, and later on in the main final version, he paints a fabulous large cloudburst at the top. The final painting is, of course, much bigger, 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters, and ultimately designed to be viewed from below when they were installed by Marouflage in the main concourse at the Johannesburg railway station. So if that's our starting point, we'll move to Irma Stern, famous, of course, for her incredibly brave travels. This is a painting called Three African Women. It's from 1941, and it shows Amamfengo women, or Fingo women, when Stern traveled in the Eastern Cape at this time. A spectacular painting in so many ways, rather strange with these two semi-distant, abstracted figures in the back, and a far more focused central figure with this wonderful pink headscarf and this beautiful detail around the embellishments of the figures' necklaces. Staying with Stern, but now moving to Madeira, to the Mediterranean, to Spain, where Stern spent a lot of time, particularly in the 1930s, and this from that period, 1938, a fisherman potentially, with this incredible, brightly painted yellow hat. He has these hooded eyes, which I suppose are in sharp contrast with these flashes of yellow above them. Amazing what's going on in the background, sort of strange shapes, strange color compositions and contrasts. Only Stern, I would argue, could so successfully combine lavenders, purples, blues, greens, creams, and whites, so wonderfully. That's Stern in Madeira in the late 1930s. If we come around here, I suppose we can get to Rome with William Kentridge, from his incredible Triumphs and Laments series, his large-scale, enormous-scale mural that he produced on the banks of the Tiber in Rome. This particular work, called Refugees, it would have been produced as a stencil initially and blasted out of the grime and dirt, century-old grime and dirt on the banks of the Tiber to reveal these incredible large-scale processional figures. These were, this was one of the most remarkable works, I would argue, in the last decade, and a work I would have died to have seen. This, a multiple produced in 2017, but it has the same kind of drama you might have expected had you seen it on the banks of the Tiber. I think we'll come round here. Sticking, of course, with our travel theme, very briefly talking about Alexis Preller. We have done more extensive videos on these two works. Preller, also an intrepid traveler. He spent time in the then Belgian Congo in 1939. He joins the war effort. He goes up to the North African campaign in 1940. He's taken a prisoner of war. He spends time in POW camps in North Africa, in the Middle East, as well as the Mediterranean. He gets decommissioned in 1943 and returns then to Pretoria. And these works, yes, are about travel, but they're more about coming home in many, many ways. Preller at the time was besotted by the Ndebele tribes on the outskirts of Pretoria, or the so-called Mapocha. And these two fabulous museum-grade works are from that early period, 1951, where he is transforming these figures into pure, special symbol and icon. A work like this, Grand Mapocha No. 2, exists as pure icon at this point. Deeply symbolic, with this wonderful ivory-colored coat, referencing sort of a matriarchal or maternal power, as well as a fertility figure. He was enormously captivated by these Mapocha women. He, I think, depicted them as devotees or priestesses moving through their almost ancient kraals, painting, of course, on their walls, which would be washed away in the rains every season, and then re-recorded, mythologies re-recorded on the walls by these women every year. Irma Stern again, one of the major paintings in the sale, and my colleague Wilhelm has done an amazing video on this particular work, painted in 1948. A very recognizable still life on the one hand, but also rather unusual on the other. A very narrow palette, lots of browns and blacks, maroons, purples, pinks, reds, terracottas, as I say, very narrow in palette. Of course, as always, related to her travel, this Mataban pot, almost certainly produced in China for the Middle Eastern market. She would have likely purchased this on one of her trips to Zanzibar between 1939 and 1945. Also, this fabulous textile you see at the bottom would most likely have been Japanese-inspired and collected on one of her travels, laid out on a table in order to be this fabulous backdrop to this, frankly, incredible painting. I spoke about the fleshiness of Pyrenees Kliprofiersberg study. This is fleshiness on another level entirely. Voluptuous in the way it's painted. These lilies might have been grown in her garden at the Firs in Cape Town, or more probably purchased from the flower sellers on Adderley Street. Back to Kentridge, although in Italy. Kentridge made a number of hugely important trips to Italy as a very young boy with his parents, essentially, and it remained and has remained an enormous source of inspiration for him throughout his career. These, the ruins of Caracallas, the famous baths, working probably at around 500 or 200 AD, have since, of course, gone into ruin. This would have been used as one of the major symbols in a very early opera that he produced called The Return of Ulysses. This, another museum-grade work, a spectacularly scaled drawing, and not the biggest man in town, but you can get a sense of just how enormous, how powerful this drawing is. You also get a sense of moment in the way William works. You can get a real sense of his chalk marks, the way things have been added and erased. An incredible drawing. Traveling again with Eduardo Villa. Villa, of course, born in Italy, trained in Italy, taken a prisoner of war, brought to South Africa, which is where he, of course, settled. This, a very, very early work from the 1950s, a work that is potentially inspired by his interest in the Mapocha or the Ndebele figures, and I think you see a similarity in this simplified triangular form and these very small edited heads. But you also get a sense of his internationalism in a work like this. You can't look at a work like this without thinking, of course, of the Italian futurists, artists like Boccioni, and there has to be some of their spirit in a work like this, cast here on the Highveld in the early 1950s in a very, very small edition. I think we'll come round here very quickly. Going up Africa to Nigeria, Peter Hugo's famous series, his so-called Hyena Men series, where he became aware of these salesmen, essentially, that used these wild animals, predominantly hyenas and baboons in some cases, in order to peddle their wares. These are dramatic photographs, these are brutal photographs in so many ways, but of course they have a wonderful dignity and beauty too. I particularly love the garments, these very creative garments worn by this gentleman hyena handler over here. Different decade, different continent again. Clement Sinek, one of our most important post-impressionist painters, a painter who spent a lot of time in Paris and who died very, very young. A Durban-based painter, although he was born in Mauritius. A painter who I would argue is one of our most fantastic colorists. A painter whose work could comfortably hang in any European interwar gallery. This work is a view, an Alpine view. It dates from 1924. Why on earth was Sinek in the Alps in 1924? Well, it was because he was on his honeymoon. He was there with his wife on honeymoon. He painted a lot of these Alpine views, so one has to wonder what his wife was doing on honeymoon, because he was certainly spending his time painting. Maud Sumner, one of her amazing views over what is likely to be the Namib, views inspired by plane trips, plane travel. These were views almost certainly inspired by the artist looking out the window and seeing these incredibly abstracted, beautiful, quiet landscapes of Africa. She, of course, spent so much of her career in the UK, in London, as well as in France. The then Southwest Africa, painted in the early 1940s by Adolf Hiench. This example also from the early 1940s, 1943, and this one from Adolf Hiench, one of my absolute favorite works on the sale, painted in 1938, showing these caracal sheep being readied for the evening, protected overnight. Now, Adolf Hiench was essentially a German-trained artist. He lived in Dresden. He was working in that city in the pre-World War II years. Dresden at the time was industrial, dark, dingy in so many ways. He leaves that city with, of course, the threat of the Nazis looming, and he arrives in the then Southwest Africa in 1938. He is completely blown away by this new alien landscape he is witnessing, these vast, extensive views that he simply was not used to from his European congested kind of a background. He spent a lot of time early on traveling around various farms on the outskirts of Namibia, where he would have painted a work like this. This is very, very early in terms of his Southwest African or Namibian output. In fact, I would argue this might be one of his very, very first paintings in the then Southwest Africa from 1938. And you get a real sense of his wonder. He is confronted by a landscape that is entirely alien, but he is completely inspired by what he's seeing. This is rather unusual in it has this fabulous pink, harshly graded arc of light, which does again give a sense of this incredible extensive vista and this very, very, very far distanced horizon that you only really experience in Namibia. His slightly later works are much more like these two examples I'm showing you here, which are much more calligraphic in their markings. He was always inspired by Chinese painting and calligraphic works, and he really settles into this kind of aesthetic from the early 1940s, which makes this painting, I would argue, particularly important and particularly special. I love the way he has these patches of greys and browns in this brickwork. Very, very unusual composition, a real focus on the decorative element that you see on the right here, yet he edits it quite dramatically in this ball of living caracal wool. I'd like to talk about this picture behind you, Mike. This is an abstract painting by Tako Patel, and again, if you're talking about cross-pollination and travel, this is an Indian-born painter who has spent the majority of his working career in Zimbabwe, although he has recently relocated to the United States. These are rather typical of his mature paintings, large scale as you can see, gentle, abstract, quiet in color, but very, very deliberate and carefully organized and arranged. Think of artists like Judd, for instance. This, I would argue, is quite a special and relatively unknown African equivalent. Some of these works by Tako Patel were shown at the major retrospective on Zimbabwean painters at the Zeitz-Mocker about 2 years ago now, a work called 5 Bob. There were a handful of works by Tako Patel on that show. As far as I'm aware, this is the first major work by Tako Patel to appear on the secondary market, and we are enormously delighted and proud that it will be sold here in the Strauss sale rooms in Johannesburg. Where can we go next? A tangential link, of course, but I must talk about Ati Patruga, who made his major international splash, his colorful arrival with one of his major works at the Venice Biennale in 2015. Very much put him on the map and in many ways turned the attention of so many major international collectors and curators onto what is going on the contemporary scene here on the southern tip of Africa. Fabulous work by William Kentridge, smaller in scale, a work directly related to a landmark event in this country, 1994, of course, the new democratic government, the new democratic spirit, typified in so many ways by Mango Groove's famous mega hit, Another Country, which few people know was enlivened by an incredible stop animation video by William Kentridge. Of course, at the time, 1994, Mango Groove was a bigger household name than Kentridge was at the time. A work from a very special period in the country's history, and a very beautiful work too. Of course, you have the megaphone, one of the artist's major symbols, this fabulous vibrating crowd, and these typical flashes of red and blue that we come to associate with William's work. Come through here past the two fabulous Penny Siopis paintings from the late 1980s, and this one, the birthday cake, from the early 1980s. These two works are by Maud Sumner. I showed you some of her probably better known Namibian paintings. These are from her time in London. These are views of Battiss Bridge, and there's certainly a good number of South Africans living in Battiss at the moment. I'd like to think that they'd be drawn to these beautifully colored, punchy watercolors. When it comes to watercolors, we're always very concerned about their condition. These are both in fabulous condition. You'll see just how strong the colors are. Also from a period in Sumner's career where she is working with brighter patches of pure color, bigger segments of color, which you can see in the barges here, for instance, on the Thames. I also love some of the sort of little ink work on the water's surface. Staying with Maud Sumner, This is one of my favorite works of hers in the sale too. It's a work being sold on behalf of the Battiss Museum in Somerset East, and the proceeds of the sale of this work will go to the museum, so a very, very good cause. It's a painting of houses in France, but what I particularly love about this work is how it can be divided into two halves if you cut a diagonal across from the top left to bottom right. The bottom left diagonal, much more segmented and patchy in the way it's painted, sort of larger segments of pure color. You look at these lime yellow, sort of sun-kissed yellows on the facades here. But this upper half, much more vibrant, much more detailed in the way it's painted, much more flickering as far as the brushstrokes go. Lovely lavender streaks across the sky, wonderful creamy whites in the clouds, and these strange registers of coral red, yellow, and a chalky lime in sections here. Fabulous, fabulous painting, as is this large-scale Namibian study. Again, almost certainly taken from the air, but you get a sense of a haze, almost a quiet cloud descending on the landscape, just revealing these sort of electric oranges and corals on the landscape. It's a work that we were discussing last night together, and Frank Kilbourne mentioned that you can't imagine how she could have improved this painting. Almost every single touch, every single stroke is absolutely perfect. Nothing really can be added or reduced. One of the many reasons why this is such a fabulous painting, and that Sumner was such an important artist. You can scan around here, look at a few highlights, Mike. I always like to point out Larry Scully and the influence of travel on his work. It's a completely different kind of travel. It's space travel. Larry Scully was in Johannesburg in the late 1960s at a time of incredible modernization. Skyscrapers were going up. There was glass, there was concrete, there was steel. It was, of course, also the beginning of the age of space travel. And Scully is deeply influenced not only by space travel, but by this incredible electrifying sense of modernity that he was witnessing in the late 60s Johannesburg. And you get a real sense of that kind of urgency in an abstract painting like this. This is a little bit later. This is from the early 1970s. His very recognizable turquoises, these wonderful concentric circles of gold and turquoise. This is a really, really fabulous example by Larry Scully. Completely different, of course, to the Black Madonna that we sold in Cape Town a month or 6 weeks ago. We've done some videos on John Mayer, of course, but you can get a glimpse of some of those in the background. Travel, I think, is important for him in terms of the fact that so many of his landscapes are composite landscapes, imaginary composite landscapes. Yes, he's traveled widely through the country and across the world, but you always get a sense of him collecting snippets of landscapes which would recreate fabulous paintings like the ones Mike's showing you at the back. I think if you'll follow me to the last section, I'll see if we can find any more travel-inspired pictures. Here, of course, Walter Battiss painting in Heraklion in Crete. Walter was, of course, inspired by his travels. He traveled regularly and widely, spent a lot of time in Greece. This is a real sort of a holiday picture painted in 1972, a mature watercolor, but a high quality work. At this point, there are very, very few South African watercolors that have the kind of control that Battiss had in the medium. Contrasted very strongly to maybe a more recognizable Walter Battiss oil, inspired by his travels around South Africa, and specifically going to rock art sites around the country. You can't really get an understanding of Tretchikoff's career without thinking about his biography and about his travels. Of course, he really began his life in the East. He spent time in Java. He was an ad man. He was essentially taken a prisoner of war, and he eventually travels to Cape Town to meet up with his family and to build what would become an enormously influential career. Of course, during his lifetime, there was nobody more successful commercially, no artists commercially more successful than Tretchi was. This is, I think, a particularly impressive still life example with the chrysanthemums in this very vertical format, showing the Japanese cloisonné vase, very carefully and beautifully painted. Peter Clark, this a work called Train Passing Through the Karoo, a small-scale watercolor and gouache work. It is gem-like. It is a beautiful, small-scale, carefully painted work by the great Cape Simonstown painter, who of course spends so much time in the Karoo. You can see the train traveling quickly across the picture plane in the background, puffing out circles of steam into the sky. A small rural home. This was a scene he used a number of times. He painted in various seasons. There's a very well-known, famous example with the foreground painted in a very summery, lush green, with sheep sort of frolicking in the foreground. He's done something very different here, of course, where he's got this beautiful, entangled, thorn-like decorative element at the bottom of the painting. It's referencing, I would argue, the great Graham Sutherland, the very important mid-century British modernist. But I think it's also picking up a similar aesthetic that Cecily Sash and Scott Ness and Jack Heath were drawn to a few decades prior. Another real gem in the sale is this Walkabout, showing rooftops in Cape Town. And when we're talking about travel, when we're talking about lockdown, to me this is a real lockdown picture. You get the idea of the artist very interested in a rather unspectacular view. He hasn't chosen a great vista, he hasn't chosen a great sky or a great desert or a great seascape. He's looking over some relatively unnoticed rooftops. You also get a sense of him up painting from a window, perhaps alone, quiet, by himself, a very private moment captured in a very beautiful small-scale painting. Phew, I think I've covered a lot of ground. I'll maybe end with the incredible group of Keith Alexanders that we are showcasing in our upcoming sale. We did a little artist focus on Keith Alexander. As you can probably tell, like Sumner, 2 generations prior, Keith Alexander was inspired by the Namibian deserts, the Namibian landscapes. Of course, what he does with them is completely different. He gives them a rather unsettling, surrealist edge. Whilst these scenes I'm showing you dead ahead might seem easy to read, might seem recognizable, when you start thinking about them, when you start looking at them more carefully, they are anything but that. These are ruins, of course inspired by Kolmanskop potentially, but they are classical ruins. The large-scale work, the epitaph, which I would like to think is going to generate enormous interest in the auction next week, is fabulous in so many ways. There are no pictures I can think of that show classical ruins, a very still water surface, and a fabulous gemsbok as an epitaph on the top of this pedestal with this sort of deep, far-reaching Namibian-inspired landscape. Taken us now on a quick-fire trip around the country and around the world through these fabulous works. They will all be going under the hammer this Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, the 16th, 17th, and 18th. As you can tell, everything is on show, open to the public. We encourage as many people as possible to come and have a look. This, I would argue, is the best cross-section of South African art you will see anywhere in the world this weekend. There are COVID restrictions in place, of course, but there's lots of space, and we do hope that as many people can come through and have a look at this remarkable group of works, which will of course be split come Monday and Tuesday. These works will never be seen again in this context. So we do encourage you to come and visit and have a look, and thank you very much.